Chapter 4. The Slaughter of Animals for Food. It is impossible that any discussion of the principle of animals' rights can be at all adequate or conclusive which ignores, as many so-called humanitarians still ignore, the immense underlying importance of the food question. The origin of the habit of flesh-eating need not greatly concern us. Let us assume, in accordance with the most favoured theory, that animals were first slaughtered by an uncivilised migratory tribes under the stress of want, and that the practice thus endangered, being fostered by the religious idea of a blood offering and propitiation, survived and increased after the early conditions which produced it had passed away. What is more important to note is that the very prevalence of the habit has caused it to be regarded as a necessary feature of modern civilization, and that this view has inevitably had a marked effect, and a very detrimental effect, on the study of man's moral relation to the lower animals. Now it must be admired, I think, that it is a difficult thing consistently to recognise or assert the rights of an animal on whom you propose to make a meal, a difficulty which has not been at all satisfactorily surmounted by those moralists who, while accepting the practice of flesh-eating as an institution which is itself beyond cavil, have nevertheless been anxious to find some solid basis for a theory of humaneness. Strange contrariety of conduct, says Goldsmith's Chinese philosopher, in commenting on this dilemma. They pity and they eat the objects of their compassion. There is also the further consideration that the sanction implicitly given to terrible cruelties inflicted on harmless cattle by the drover and the slaughterman render it, by parity of reasoning, well nigh impossible to abolish many other acts of injustice that we see everywhere around us. And this obstacle the opponents of humanitarian reform have not been slow to utilise. Hence a disposition on the part of many otherwise humane writers to fight shy of the awkward subject of the slaughterhouse, or to gloss it over with a series of contradictory and quite irrelevant excuses. Let me give you a few examples. We deprive animals of life, says Bentham, in a delightfully naive application of the utilitarian philosophy, and this is justifiable. Their plans do not equal our enjoyments. By the scheme of universal providence, says Lawrence, the services between man and beast are intended to be reciprocal, and the greater part of the latter can by no other means requite human labour and care than by the forfeiture of life. Schopenhauer's plea is somewhat similar to the foregoing. Man deprived of all flesh food, especially in the north, would suffer more than the animal suffers in a swift and unforeseen death. Still, we ought to mitigate it by the help of chloroform. Then there is the argument so frequently founded on the supposed sanction of nature. My scruples, wrote Lord Chesterfield, remained unreconciled to the committing of so horrid a meal, till upon serious reflection I became convinced of its legality from the general order of nature, which has instituted the universal preying upon the weaker as one of her first principles. Finally, we find the redoubtable Paley discarding as valueless the whole appeal to nature and, relying on the ordinances of Holy Writ, a right to the flesh of animals. Some excuse means necessary for the pain and loss which we occasion to animals by restraining them of their liberty, mutilating their bodies, and at last putting an end to their lives for our pleasure or convenience. The reasons alleged in vindication of this practice are the following: that the several species of animals being created to prey upon one another affords a kind of analogy to prove that the human species were intended to feed on them. Upon which reason I would observe that the analogy contended for is extremely lame, since animals have no power to support life by any other means, and since we have, for the whole human species might subsist entirely upon fruit, pulse, herbs and roots, as many tribes of Hindus actually do, it seems to me it would be difficult to defend this right by any arguments which the light and order of nature afford, and that we are beholden for it to the permission recorded in Scripture. It is evident from the above quotations, which might be indefinitely extended, that the fable of the wolf and the lamb is constantly repeating itself in the attitude of our moralists and philosophers towards the victims of the slaughterhouse, while might Humphrey Primet remark that we ransack and rack all nature in her weakest and tenderest parts, to extort from her, if possible, any concession whereon to rest the appearance of an argument. Far wiser and humaner on this particular subject is the tone adopted by such writers as Michelet, who, while not seeing any way of escape from the practice of flesh eating, at least refrain from attempting to support it by fallacious reasonings. The animals below us, says Michelet, have also their rights before God. Animal life, sombre mystery, immense world of thoughts and of dumb sufferings. All nature protests against the barbarity of man, who misapprehends, who humiliates, who tortures his inferior brethren. Life, death, the daily murder which feeding upon animals implies, those hard and bitter problems sternly place themselves before my mind. Miserable contradiction. Let us hope that there may be another globe in which the base, the cruel fatalities of this may be spared to us. Meanwhile, however, the simple fact remains true, and is every year finding more and more scientific corroboration, that there is no such cruel fatality as that which Michelet imagined. Comparative anatomy has shown that man is not carnivorous, but frugivorous in his natural structure. Experience has shown that flesh food is wholly unnecessary for the support of healthy life. The importance of this more general recognition of a truth which has in all our ages been familiar to a few enlightened thinkers can hardly be overestimated in its bearing on the question of animals' rights. It clears away a difficulty which has long damped the enthusiasm or warped the judgment of the humaner school of European moralists, and makes it possible to approach the subject of man's moral relation to the lower animals in a more candid and fearless spirit of inquiry. It is no part of my present purpose to advocate the cause of vegetarianism, but in view of the mass of evidence readily obtainable that the transit and slaughter of animals are necessarily attended by most atrocious cruelties, and that a large number of persons have for years been living healthily without the use of flesh meat, it must at least be said that to omit this branch of the subject from the most earnest and strenuous consideration is playing with the question of animals' rights. 50 or 100 years ago, there was perhaps some excuse for supposing that vegetarianism was a mere fad. There is absolutely no such excuse at the present time. There are 2 points of especial significance in this connection. First, that as civilization advances, the cruelties inseparable from the slaughtering system have been aggravated rather than diminished, owing both to the increased necessity of transporting animals long distances by sea and land under conditions of hurry and hardship which generally preclude any sort of humane regard for their comfort, and to the clumsy and barbarous methods of slaughtering too, often practised in those ill-constructed dens of torment known as private slaughterhouses. Secondly, that the feeling of repugnance caused among all people of sensibility and refinement by the sight, or mention, or even thought of the business of the butcher are also largely on the increase, so that the details of the revolting process are, as far as possible, kept carefully out of sight and out of mind, being delegated to a pariah class who do the work which most educated persons would shrink from doing for themselves. In these 2 facts, we have clear evidence. First, there is a good reason why the public conscience, or at any rate the humanitarian conscience, should be uneasy concerning the slaughter of livestock, and the secondly, that this uneasiness is already to large extent developed and manifested. The common argument adopted by many apologists of flesh eating, as for fox hunting, that the pain inflicted by the death of the animals is more than compensated by the pleasure enjoyed by them in their lifetime, since otherwise they would not have been brought into existence at all, is ingenious rather than convincing, being indeed none other than the old familiar fallacy already commented on, the arbitrary trick of constituting ourselves the spokesmen and interpreters of our victims. Mr. E.B. Nicholson, for example, is of the opinion that we may pretty safely take it that if he, the fox, were able to understand and answer the question, he would choose life, with all its plans and risks, to non-existence without them. Unfortunately for the soundness of this suspiciously partial assumption, there is no recorded instance of this strange alternative having ever been submitted either to fox or philosopher. That precedent has yet to be established on which to found a judgment. Meantime, instead of committing the gross absurdity of talking of non-existence as a state which is good or bad or in any way comparable to existence, we might do well to remember that animals' rights, if we admit them at all, must begin with the birth and can only end with the death of the animals in question, and that we cannot evade our just responsibilities by any such quibbling references to imaginary antenatal choice in an imaginary antenatal condition. The most mischievous effect of the practice of flesh eating, in its influence on the study of animals' rights at the present time, is that it so stultifies and debases the very raison d'etre of countless myriads of beings. It brings them into life for no better purpose than to deny their right to live. It is idle to appear to the internecine warfare that we see in some aspects of wild nature, where the weaker animal is often the prey of the stronger. For there, apart from the fact that cooperation largely modifies competition, the weaker races at least live their own lives and take their chance in the game, whereas the victims of the human carnivora are bred and fed and from the first predestined to untimely slaughter, so that the whole mode of living is warped from its natural standard, and they are scarcely more than animated beef or mutton or pork. This, I contend, is a flagrant violation of the rights of lower animals, as those rights are now beginning to be apprehended by the humaner conscience of mankind. It has been well said, to keep a man, slave or servant for your own advantage, merely to keep an animal that you may eat it, is a lie. You cannot look that man or animal in the face. That those who are aware of the horrors involved in slaughtering, and also aware of the possibility of a fleshless diet, should think it sufficient to oppose scriptural permission as an answer to the arguments of food reformers, is an instance of the extraordinary power of custom to blind the eyes and the hearts of otherwise humane men. The following passage is quoted from a plea for mercy to animals, as a typical instance of the sort of perverted sentiment to which I allude. Not in superstitions India only, says the writer, whose ideas of what constitutes superstition seem to be rather confused, but in this country there are vegetarians and other persons who object to the use of animal food, not on the ground of health only, but as involving a power to which man has no right. To such statements we have only to oppose the clear permission of the divine author of life, but the unqualified permission can never give sanction to the infliction of unnecessary pain. But if the use of flesh meat can itself be dispensed with, how can it be argued that the pain, which is inseparable from slaughtering, can be otherwise than unnecessary also? I trust that the cause of humanity and justice, not mercy, to the lower animals is not likely to be retarded by any such sentimental and superstitious objections as these. Reform of diet will doubtless be slow, and attended in many individual cases with its difficulties and drawbacks. At least we may lay down this much as incumbent on all humanitarian thinkers, that everyone must satisfy himself of the necessity, the real necessity, of the use of flesh food before he comes to any intellectual conclusion on the subject of animals' rights. It is easy to see, as the question is more and more discussed, the result will be more and more decisive. Whatever my own practice may be, wrote Thoreau, I have no doubt that it is a part of the destiny of the human race in its gradual improvement to leave off eating animals, as surely as the savage tribes have left off eating each other when they came into contact with the more civilized.